This edition of World in Action is about bronchitis. Every care has been taken to avoid unnecessary distress, but in view of the subject matter, the program may be unsuitable for viewers of a nervous disposition.
There is a disease which in Britain causes more death and pain and misery than in any other country in the world. The name of that disease is bronchitis. In Britain, bronchitis killed 39,148 people in 1963, the last full year for which official statistics are available.
The death rate from bronchitis in Britain is already twice that of Italy, which is the next worst sufferer, 13 times as high as in France, and 24 times higher than in the United States. It is clear from figures like these why doctors call bronchitis the English disease. For every 3 people who die of lung cancer, bronchitis kills 4. For every 3 people who die on the roads, bronchitis kills 15.
Despite this death toll, most people seem to be unaware of exactly what bronchitis is or how serious it can be.
I think it's very widespread, but I don't think it's all that serious because I serve a lot of people who've got bronchitis and they seem to live to a ripe old age.
Well, I don't know a lot about it, but as I said, it's just like a cold on the chest. You just take tablets, I suppose, and get rid of it.
One of Britain's leading medical authorities on bronchitis explains exactly what the disease is.
Well, bronchitis is a word meaning inflammation of the bronchi, or the bronchial tubes which carry air in and out of the lungs. In fact, it's usually an irritation. It starts off with the tubes producing too much of the mucus film that covers them normally, and this is produced as phlegm, which is coughed up. And if anybody produces phlegm, which is actually coughed up, it means their bronchial tubes are overworking and there's something wrong. Then it goes on to infection, and this is shown by the phlegm being yellow in color. And then the last and most disabling stage is where the bronchial tubes begin to be narrowed so that the air doesn't flow in and out of them as easily as it should. And ultimately, this is what finishes him off, because if you can't get enough air in and out of your lungs, you can't breathe, you can't go on living.
Chronic bronchitis is a disease which develops gradually. A man may have it for as long as 20 years without knowing he has a serious illness. At first, the only warning symptom is an occasional cough in the morning and the spitting up of phlegm. This may become worse in the winter, but is generally shrugged off.
No, I never cough. Never at all. I just bring out a phlegm occasionally, but never cough at all.
Well, actually, mostly when I'm smoking, I'll cough a time or two, but I don't cough all that amount.
Just because I cough, I got bronchitis, is that what you mean? Yeah? No.
What happens next is that the coughing becomes more frequent. Again, this happens so slowly and so gradually that it comes to be accepted as a normal part of life. At the same time, breathing becomes wheezy, and so much phlegm is coughed up that the bronchitic is forced to spit in public places. So gradual is the development of bronchitis that generally it's not till after the age of 45 that it becomes disabling enough to be brought to the notice of a doctor. Bronchitis is twice as likely to attack a man as a woman, and 4 out of every 10 men in this country ignore this early symptom.
This is the sputum brought up by a working man during the first hour in the morning, and this is bronchitis. We find that 4 out of every 10 working men in this country produce amount of phlegm of this sort of amount. But you see, it is quite small, that. When we come to this amount, we find about 1 in 10 of the men produce so much, and about 1 in 20 produce as much as that. And by this time, they're getting pretty severely disabled.
The unsuspecting victim ignores the gradual increase in the amount of phlegm and therefore is unaware that bronchitis is gaining a strong grip. But the measure of any human disease cannot be calculated only in a chemical laboratory. It has to be seen in terms of people, like this man who is disabled by chronic bronchitis.
The case of George Smith is typical in showing the slow build-up of chronic bronchitis. Mr. Smith, a retired dustman, lives in rooms over a butcher's shop in Fulham, London. He pays 34 shillings a week rent, and he has 4 flights of stairs to climb down and up from the outside lavatory. He had to give up work because of bronchitis. As a young man, he was a fit man. He was an army boxer and an amateur footballer.
I've run the refuse collecting for 23 years on the council, Chelsea Borough Council, and never had a day's illness. I had a cough just the same as anybody else of the daytime, morning when I got up, but never realised that anything was serious the matter with me.
This too is bronchitis at its extreme degree. This man's bronchial tubes are so clogged up that air to keep him alive can no longer get through. So the doctors had to cut open his windpipe and fix a metal tube to get air in and out of his lungs. This same man 2 years ago choked and could no longer breathe. For 6.5 minutes he was dead. The doctors revived him with heart massage. They put a tube in his throat, and he continues to cling on to life.
Essentially, there are 2 types of bronchitis, acute bronchitis and chronic bronchitis. A family doctor outlines the differences.
Acute bronchitis is a sudden infection of the lungs and the bronchial tubes, whereas chronic bronchitis is a condition that goes on and on for very many years. And it's quite common, as we all know, that babies and young children suffer from attacks of acute bronchitis. But in this group, it doesn't necessarily, and usually it doesn't at all, go on to this condition that we know is chronic bronchitis. In adults, I would say they are inseparable because chronic bronchitis are the main contenders for the acute bronchitis which we get, or they get during the winter. In this country, when one speaks of bronchitis, what we all really mean is chronic bronchitis.
Now, what causes chronic bronchitis, and why is this terrible disease so common in Britain? Hear from some of the doctors who make bronchitis their special concern. First, the senior house surgeon of a London hospital which specializes in the treatment of bronchitis.
I think that we have a bad reputation for bronchitis because a lot of factors come together rather than any one individual one. In particular, we have much atmospheric pollution. In addition, people pollute their own atmosphere by smoking, which has a disastrous effect on the incidence of bronchitis. Then we have very large conurbations of people with high density occupation of homes and houses, so that people infect one another more easily. And then we have this peculiar type of winter climate in which there's a tendency for still air to remain over the river valleys where so many of our great towns are found, so that the smoke and pollution accumulates and people are breathing highly irritant fog.
Next, a senior lecturer in occupational health.
Any of the factors which cause irritation of the respiratory passages all contribute to bronchitis. The important ones are air pollution and smoking, and this may be aggravated by dust or fume at work.
And finally, a chest and heart specialist.
Air pollution is certainly an important factor, and I would not deny this, but it is very rare to find a chronic bronchitic who is not a significant smoker, and I would put cigarette smoking as a much more important agent than air pollution.
The doctors agree that bronchitis has 3 main causes. Alphabetically, they are atmospheric pollution, living conditions, and smoking. But the doctors are not agreed on which is the major villain. So tonight, we examine the case against each in turn.
First, consider the case against atmospheric pollution.
Wherever we work and wherever we live, the one thing that affects us all is the very air we breathe. And in our industrial towns and cities, the air is heavily laden with the dirt and contamination which add to bronchitis. For beyond doubt, bronchitis thrives on dirty air. Consider this evidence.
In December 1952, a thick black smog, a mixture of air pollution and fog, hung over London for 5 days. During those days, 4,000 Londoners died. The following year, the government set up a special inquiry into atmospheric pollution headed by Sir Hugh Beaver, a scientist. In 1954, the Beaver Committee reported,
"There is a clear association between pollution and the incidence of bronchitis."
To try to establish just how close is this link, World in Action mapped out the government statistics showing those parts of Britain which suffered the heaviest air pollution on a typical winter's day. The blacker the area, the dirtier the air. These white dots now show the places in Britain where the death rate from bronchitis is heaviest. And in practically every case, the bronchitis deaths are highest where the pollution is greatest.
But it was a research team from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine who established the most significant piece of evidence linking bronchitis with air pollution. As long ago as 1958, they published their findings on the health of postmen in town and country throughout Britain. This survey disclosed that sickness absence rates from bronchitis increased with the level of air pollution, and that for every postman who died from bronchitis in country districts, 4 died in the heavily polluted cities.
The air we breathe is polluted in 3 ways: with smoke, with grit and dust, and with sulfur dioxide. Smoke and grit and dust are the visible forms of air pollution. Sulfur dioxide is an invisible and poisonous gas.
In 1956, Parliament introduced the Clean Air Act to reduce the amount of smoke in the atmosphere. The main targets were the so-called black areas, 2,119 square miles of industrial towns and cities, mainly in the Midlands and north of England. Today, nearly 9 years later, 4/5 of the black areas remain black. They still burn coal, which is still the main cause of smoke pollution, and the air remains foul. World in Action flew over some of these black areas. This is what the pollution looks like from above, where it can be seen most clearly. Here is the record of some of these places, and observe closely the white dots that tell of bronchitis deaths.
Derby, out of 8,000 acres, only 985 are smoke controlled. The target date for completion is 1986.
Nearby Ilkeston has no smoke controlled premises. Its target date is 1983.
Walsall has 360 acres smoke controlled out of 8,777 acres. Its target date is 1980.
West Bromwich, out of 7,172 acres, has only 1/5 of the area in operation.
Farther north, St Helens has no smoke controlled premises.
Accrington has done nothing.
Nelson has no smoke-controlled areas. Its program has been postponed indefinitely.
Towns like Tynemouth, Hartlepool, Stockton and Darlington are among the many industrial areas in the northeast which have no smokeless zones.
The National Society for Clean Air is not satisfied at the rate of progress. Dr. Albert Parker is the president of the society.
The emission of smoke from industrial chimneys has halved since 1956, which is not bad. But the emission of smoke from domestic chimneys has only been reduced by about 1/5, which, in my view, is not nearly fast enough.
But laboratory tests show that the invisible pollution from sulfur dioxide has gone up. This is mainly because we're using more heavy oil and low-grade coal, both of which contain a lot of sulfur, and even smokeless fuel produces sulfur dioxide. There is evidence that sulfur dioxide affects the bronchial tubes. Yet the Clean Air Act does not include this gas among its prohibitions. The chest physician at a London hospital regards this as a serious omission.
The Clean Air Act only proposes to deal with the actual smoke and grit. In other words, it makes the air appear clean, but it doesn't do anything to deal with the question of the sulfur dioxide, which is most probably the main killer. In this way, I feel that this act, by evading the main problem of sulfur dioxide, is in fact deluding and swindling the public.
The Clean Air Society, however, recognizes the difficulties.
That is a very difficult problem, because there is no known practicable means of removing sulfur dioxide from fuels or from the flue gases. And all that can be done is to let the domestic consumer go over, say, to gas or electricity so that they're not emitting sulfur dioxide. and for industrial chimneys and power stations, have high chimneys to get as much dispersion into the air and as much dilution as is possible.
Pollution of all kinds can be measured by meters like this one, sucking in the air from outside the city analyst's office in the center of Leeds. Sulfur dioxide is trapped in a bottle. Visible pollution is trapped on a paper filter. Now, this is what the filter looked like on an average day this winter. 5.5 times this amount would have been breathed in by a pair of human lungs in the same 24 hours. The chief consultant chest physician at Leeds General Infirmary treats bronchitis patients who have been breathing this sort of air all their lives.
This is the city of Leeds. During the next year, 500 of these residents will be dead from bronchitis. The individual who is unfortunate enough to be born in this background, in this kind of environment, is starting off life with a difficulty which his more fortunate brothers in the south of England don't have to contend with. That the air pollution in these industrial cities is of such a magnitude that the irritation to the bronchial tree starts from early childhood, perseveres and persists throughout adolescence and into early adult life. And it's my estimation that in this city of Leeds, that something like 60% of all adult males over 50 are bronchitic within the normally accepted sense of the definition. I think one can say, therefore, that the young man who is born in this city is born with a cross of bronchitis firmly on his shoulders.
But in Salford, Lancashire, bronchitis deaths are the highest anywhere in Britain, and they've had to build a special hospital ward for bronchitics. Dr. Lance Byrne is Salford's medical officer of health.
I'm glad to say my authority has at least reduced the smoke by 1/3, but we've lacked that tremendous conviction and energy and drive which is necessary to clean the air. Little has been done. Some authorities have done nothing. No wonder there's 36,000 deaths from bronchitis and perhaps some 50,000 deaths altogether from respiratory disease. Misery-producing diseases. That's the point which gets me, that people are suffering in body and in mind unnecessarily from breathing contaminated air when they've got the God-given right to breathe pure air. And 20,000 lungfuls a day, every day of every year. You just need to look around you. This is all wrong.
One of the main difficulties in making the Clean Air Act work is that it costs a lot of money to convert furnaces in the factories and fireplaces in the home from coal to smokeless fuels. But determination as well as money is needed to clean the air.
And one place in the world where they have used both is a mining town, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, center of the American coal and steel industries. In the 10 years from 1947, the City Council of Pittsburgh paid out $250 million, nearly 84 million pounds, to help industry and householders convert furnaces and boilers. By 1957, only 10 years after the initial campaign was introduced, Pittsburgh had cut down its pollution by 89%. Last year, they filtered 135,000 tons of soot and dust out of the chimneys and furnaces of industry and dumped it on waste ground just outside the city. In the past 20 years, a total of 5.5 million tons of soot and dust has been prevented from going in the air over Pittsburgh, much of which could have been breathed into people's lungs.
But in Britain, too many of our towns and cities still look like this, and bronchitis continues to thrive in this kind of street and in this kind of house. In country and suburban houses like these, where for the most part live professional men and their families, there are fewer cases of bronchitis.
This is a fact shown in the Registrar General's latest statistics of occupational mortality. These statistics show that proportionately, for every professional person who dies of bronchitis, 5 unskilled laborers die of the same disease. The lower the standard of living, the higher the bronchitis rate. Here again from the occupational health expert.
The person who can afford to take the extra day or two off person who, on the whole, has better medical care, the person who perhaps lives in a nicer house where there's less air pollution, is less likely to develop progressive bronchitis.
These are the conditions where bronchitis flourishes, where the lavatories in the backyard and the houses huddle back to back, where a cold tap provides the only running water, where families have waited 6 months for the landlord to repair a broken window, where other families have given up hope of the damp and falling plaster ever being repaired. Here, bronchitis is commonplace.
There's no house in the street hasn't got somebody with a cough, I can tell you that.
And the poor man next door, he coughs something shocking every night. And I've heard him getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, trying to get his breath outside in the yard. That's how bad he is.
I've got bronchitis. I've been to the hospital and they put me on breathing exercises. But there's not much you can do in these conditions at these houses.
My little boy never suffered with bronchitis, and yet they took him away with bronchitis when he was 2 years old.
Oh, the children are coughing, yes. Oh, I can hear them while they're out playing.
Many people have to live in conditions which promote bronchitis. But many people, too, work in jobs which carry a heavy risk of bronchitis.
Bronchitis is commoner in some occupations than it is in others, but it's not an officially recognized prescribed industrial disease, but occupations such as mining or work in foundries, anywhere where there is a lot of dust or fume, or where there is hard manual work, or sometimes working out of doors in all weathers, tends to have a high rate from bronchitis.
Since bronchitis is not an officially recognized industrial disease, its victims get no compensation for being forced out of work through their illness. And this hits no one harder than the coal miners, whose bronchitis rate is twice the national average.
Finally, consider the evidence against smoking, a habit shared by nearly 2/3 of British adults of all classes. Medical opinion is almost unanimous in condemning cigarette smoking as a major cause of chronic bronchitis.
The chief irritant, undoubtedly, is cigarette smoke. So many people have what they call a smoker's cough, as if this was a normal thing for smokers to have. Unfortunately, it's all too frequent in smokers, but people who have a smoker's cough and produce phlegm have got abnormal bronchial tubes. They've got bronchitis.
This shows what happens to the bronchial tubes when cigarette smoke is inhaled. The tubes are lined with minute hairs which constantly move. Their job is to catch impurities, mainly dust specks, and carry them back to the throat to be swallowed. Now, in a cigarette smoker, these hairs become paralyzed, so the impurities accumulate. This results in irritation, which in turn leads to persistent coughing. Machines like this are used in medical research laboratories to discover what precisely is in the smoke of a cigarette. And according to this report of the US Department of Health, Education and Welfare, there are no fewer than 9 poisonous gases.
In Britain, cigarettes are smoked by 3/4 of all men and half the women. Medical experts are certain that these smokers run a much greater risk of getting bronchitis than non-smokers. Evidence for this belief is based largely on a survey of the health of 40,000 doctors, smokers and non-smokers alike, carried out over the last 10 years by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, Professor of Medical Statistics at London University, and Dr. Richard Doll of the Medical Research Council Statistical Unit. From the findings of these 2 experts, the Royal College of Physicians in Smoking and Health reported.
Doll and Hill found a steady increase of bronchitis death rates with increasingly heavy smoking. Those smoking more than 25 cigarettes a day having a death rate from bronchitis 6 times greater than that of non-smokers.
Those who find little comfort in this evidence take hope in statistics, which seem to indicate that heavy smoking and the bronchitis death rate are not always closely linked.
The Americans smoke 75 cigarettes a week on average. Their bronchitis deaths are 4.5 in every 100,000 people. In Britain, we smoke less, 53.7 a week, and yet our bronchitis deaths are 112.3 in every 100,000.
But however statistics are used, the overwhelming and brutal facts are that bronchitis is not recognized early enough, and that in its advanced stages it cannot be cured.
Unfortunately, you can't give a new pair of lungs to somebody who's had bronchitis for a long time. The trouble is that people accept a chronic cough as just the normal, doctor, just the usual. It is not normal to cough. It is not normal to bring up phlegm. And people tolerate this in the same way that they tolerate wet weekends or cold feet. It's an act of God. It isn't. Well, now, I regard a chronic cough as a warning that they may get the creeping chokes.
All that the doctors can do for the extreme sufferers is to try to make their lives a shade more bearable. Experiments are now being carried out in special air-conditioned wards. Curiously, the Ministry of Health has no record of how many such places there are. Our own national survey showed there are only 4 such special wards for bronchitis in the whole of Britain.
Another experiment is this clinic at Willesden in London. Started 4 years ago, its aim is to discover bronchitics before permanent damage has been done to their lungs and to prevent the damage getting worse. Patients are encouraged to stop smoking. They are inoculated against influenza. They are given a stock of antibiotic pills to take at the first sign of infection. And they learn to use more efficiently what lung capacity they still have.
But experiments of this type are the result of the initiative and concern of a few doctors. There is still no national coordination or policy for bronchitis, as there was for tuberculosis, which is being rapidly eliminated from Britain. For instance, at this moment in Britain, only around £500,000 a year of public money is spent on bronchitis research. This is just 1/40th part of the 20 million a year that it costs the National Health Service to treat bronchitis.
The price of bronchitis does not stop there. Last year it cost 29 million working days. That's a full year's work by 116,000 men, the entire male working population of a city the size of Newcastle.
Clearly, bronchitis is a disease too costly to continue to bear, but till some cure can be found, it's important to try to reduce the numbers who will fall victim. The doctors have little doubt on how this has to be done.
I think if we accelerated the rate at which we cleaned up the air of our cities, and if in particular a really serious campaign is launched to prevent people from smoking, particularly if they have chest trouble, then I feel we'll make very great progress in helping eradicate this disease.
The most important thing, which is entirely in the control of the individual, is to stop smoking. He may not accept this. He will prefer to lay the blame at air pollution because he is less responsible for doing anything about this himself. He can blame the government. He can blame somebody else for that. But smoking is something he can and should do himself.
But whether we're smokers or not, the one person most of us have to rely on to treat bronchitis is the local doctor. And he's not always satisfied that he's being sufficiently backed by the government. Here again, from a general practitioner.
The general practitioner feels powerless, and quite honestly, he is pretty powerless to do much about it. It's not fair to expect the GPs to do this on their own. This is a very big problem. It needs a lot of cooperative efforts to bring this problem to the public and try and show them that, in fact, this is a worthwhile condition to prevent. That in the early stages, this is the time to prevent it.
A final warning about bronchitis comes from the cold tables of statistical fact. It is this. In 1960, 29,280 people died from bronchitis in Britain. Every year since then, the figures have gone up steadily. Not only that, in 1960, 1 in 20 people in Britain died of bronchitis. Last year, it was 1 in every 17. So shocking are these statistics that as long ago as March 1963, the British Medical Journal, the authoritative voice of Britain's doctors, declared,
"It is shameful to the health services of Britain that this disease should be so prominent as a cause of sickness and death, and that comparatively little should have been done to remedy matters."
And never to be forgotten is the fact that the man who can only breathe through a tube in his throat, and the man who is almost unable to climb his stairs, and this man have the same disease as the 7 million of us who cough up phlegm in the mornings. Bronchitis. The ultimate shame of bronchitis is this. It is overwhelmingly a disease caused by man himself in the way he chooses to live. And it lies largely in the power of the government and people of Britain to banish it. For many of the bronchitics in this program, this fight will come too late. But they've taken part to serve us with clear and dreadful warning.
I don't mind people seeing me in this condition because of the fact I want the general public and the people in general to see how distressing this particular complaint is.